You want to be able to give them what they come there for, but you need to be, like you said, keep opening the doors, keep opening the doors, keep opening the doors. So different people will come in, and that, because otherwise you risk becoming, sclerotic, where your creative arteries just fill up with plaque, and it's the same thing over and over and over again. Then it's just ritualistic, and there's no way out of that.
I can't easily talk to people or drink with the rabbit mask on.
Day in the life of a Empire shoot was problem solving, having a lot of fun, punctuated by moments of frustration because things like there being no money and crew getting pissed off and that kind of stuff.
And I've gone all over the world and climbed hills and valleys and dales and swamps and rain and everything, just to find the more original Dance Macabre artwork, which comes from the 1400s. And I pretty much stop around the 1800s, because after that it gets too modern for me.
It got horrible reviews. I mean, it got 1-star reviews, half-star reviews. You can keep the keep. Keep away from the keep. And those are the headlines, And that's also the title of my book. Hey, guys, come on.
When this show started, I wanted it to be very much in the spirit of the classic horror host shows.
Well, also with the horror genre, you can read horror novels and get a completely different experience. It's not formulaic. You can read a Rath James White book, and that's very, very different from a Charles L. Grant book.
It's harder and harder to find something genuinely scary. And I think that the trick of it, at least for me, for the stuff that I prefer, is that nuanced way of having things happen in the foreground and the background, so that there's no place that you can, like, quote, stand in the story and be safe.
I think I agree. And I also think that there's an element of us in that too, right? It's knowing our place, right? This idea, I think there's a megalomania in human nature and a kind of narcissism in human nature. Maybe.
Other avenues that I want to go down. It's not like a late blooming realization. I've always had these things that I wanted to explore. I wouldn't have done so many different kinds of horror if that compulsion to keep exploring wasn't there, or and the foray into crime fiction. The need for a new horizon is there, rather than just staking out the same turf.
Lord, this is huge. So nobody's really talking about this right now. So The Pale Door, which is my next, it's a horror western that I made with Joe R. Lansdale, and easily the most ambitious film I've ever made, most personal film I've ever made. And we've been talking about it, and we're like, look, let's just put this out in August. If there are some theaters open, we'll do some socially distanced theaters, but let's push it in drive-ins.
I think you got a call or a fax from some lady in Hawaii. She says, my sister has just died, and I find among her effects a manuscript called The Shadow Out of Time by H.P. Lovecraft. Do you want it?
And I think if you read a good horror story, it's almost like a vacuum cleaner. It hoovers up those fears. It gives you, scares you. I think in a way it's quite therapeutic, and
we need some fun, man. We need to listen to more music, read more books, just do things we enjoy.
One night the phone rang, and it was my dad, and he said, if you're not busy tonight, I've done something I think is pretty good, and I think maybe you and the boys might enjoy it. I think it's pretty good. Yeah, pretty good. And it was The Grinch.
A genre of the dramatic arts that seeks to elicit a response from within an array of dark emotions: fear, anxiety, disgust, paranoia, terror, stress, gallows humor, etc.
Welcome back to Visited by Voices Live. It is Friday the 5th, and I am joined today by Kevin Lucia. Now, Kevin and I share a lot in common. We started writing and getting published about the same time. We'll go into that a little bit, but we share a very similar trajectory. And I think this is also going to be a great evening to discuss just kind of the state of horror from a ground perspective, because unlike some of the guests I've had, which I've been very fortunate to have incredible guests on this show, but unlike some of the guests, Kevin and I pretty much worked in the trenches. And I think that's a very unique viewpoint that I think will help give a grasp of what, as readers or film fans or other writers, really what we're up against going forward and what we need to really start supporting a lot more heartily. So welcome to the show, Kevin.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So I always start these conversations the same way, pretty much. But before we get to the first memory that you can remember that got you into the horror genre, do me a favor, just tell the audience a little bit about yourself. I mean, it's okay to mention the books, the titles like Things Slip Through, Devourer of Souls, Long Night in the Valley. Anything you're particularly proud of, anything that's not easily accessible by a bio that I could not possibly research, anything you'd like.
Sure. So I write horror. I'm heavily influenced by the work of by Charles Grant, Gary Braunbeck. Even before I discovered those authors, I was always like, well, I would love to write stories that are all set in the same small town where stories would intersect and cross over. I didn't really want to write sequels that were contingent on, if I read book 3 and now I have to read book 1. I kind of wanted to develop this world, this strange little town up in the Adirondacks where odd things happen, and I was very fortunate many years ago when Joe Mindhart from Crystal Lake took a chance on my first short story collection, Things Slip Through, which is a linked collection, because I love the Martian Chronicles. I love Dandelion Wine. I love Winesburg, Ohio, those types of collected, novel and stories. And I've been very fortunate to publish most of my books through them, with all these strange things happening in a small little town. And I have self-published 1 or 2 books simply kind of as one-offs, like you mentioned, Long Night in the Valley. And that was just kind of a story I couldn't find a place for, so I self-published that. My most recent book, which I'm really happy about, is Mystery Road, which is my first book with Cemetery Dance Publications, which came out last spring. And that was really, really nice when I finally got that illustrated hardcover in my hands. That was a nice moment. That was. So, but I also write a column for cemeterydance.com called Revelations, which kind of details how I moved from a very cliched view of horror, because there was a period of 4 or 5 years where I was really intentionally reading the old masters, like really casting my net. And every month I write a column for Cemetery Dance reflecting on some of these writers that really impacted me. And I also host a YouTube show myself called Into the Abyss. And it's myself and I'm a fellow writer, C.W. Breyer, and one of my fellow teachers. And like I told Lauren before the show, really it's just us drinking in my horror cave, talking about horror, and we happen to have the camera on. So that's basically a little bit what. And my day job is I teach high school English. So I'm really fortunate to have my entire life, my day job, and then my side occupation is always about writing and literature or poetry or theater. It's really the best scenario I could have possibly hoped for.
And we already have a question in the chat, but I'm going to hold off on it. I'm not ignoring you, Dan. I promise. Because we have to start with the beginning. I mean, that's what it takes. We all had some inciting incident, some horror bug that bit us early in our lives. Do you have a specific memory?
I do, and I have to confess that I came to the horror genre a little late. Although when you look at my interests, it was always going to happen. But when I was a kid, especially a high school student, when I first started thinking, I really want to write, I was really actually more of a sci-fi fan. You know, when I graduated from high school is when the first new batch of Star Wars novels by Timothy Zahn came out. And I was a rabid Star Wars freak. So when those things came out, like they were like gold, right? I had the only Star Wars novels that were available at that time were the novelizations. If you were lucky enough to find the Han Solo novels, and the one day I stumbled over Splinter of a Mind's Eye by Alan Dean Foster, I was like, it's like a beam
The real sequel.
Yeah, I was like coming down from heaven. So I wanted to be, and my first love was actually Isaac Asimov. I discovered the Foundation series in my high school library. So I thought I wanted to be a science fiction writer. And I remember all through college, I watched every sci-fi movie I could. I even wrote a sci-fi novel, and I even sent it to Tor, and I actually have a rejection letter from Tor. But it was kind of gnawing at me that maybe sci-fi, because to be honest, science, mathematics, engineering, not really my forte. There are very few people, and this is probably just my personal opinion. I think there's very few people who can write powerful science fiction and have it being focused on the human, like Ray Bradbury. Although Bradbury always claimed he wrote science fantasy and not science fiction. But I just knew that something's not, if this is an engine and I'm trying to write sci-fi, all the cylinders are not firing. So what happened was, and I don't really, the age, the time is a little fuzzy. Somewhere around 21, 22, 23. My friends and I, we used to go up to Cooperstown, New York, because my best friend, his grandmother had a cabin on the lake. So we would go up there and hang out and boat around in the lake. And one day we're just hanging out in the dock. And my one friend goes, well, we should take Kevin up to the Devil House. And I'm like,
wait, before you go any further, that is the best thing that you can say to a kid ever. Just let every kid hear that. So everyone out there watching, next time you're around a kid, say that no matter if you intend to or not. It's the best thing ever.
No, so I grew up in the country anyway. So what did we do for fun? Trespass, set things on fire, and go run around. Like I'll tell my kids today in school, look, I used to tell my mom, I'm going to go walk by the tracks. I'll be back like, I don't know. You know, my dad used to tell me about how he lived in Whitney Point. He'd be like, yeah, we used to ride our bikes to Marathon like an hour away and camp out. So that's how different it was. But my friend's like, let's go to the Devil House. And I'm like, what is the Devil House? And my other friend goes, it's just this old farmhouse out in the middle of an old field. It's no big deal. Kids go in there, right? Because this was like, we were just past the 80s and 90s. Like kids write 666 on the walls, stuff like that. Now, you know that I was not a horror fan at this point, because anyone who hears old farmhouse in the middle of the field would be like running at this point. But I'm like, okay, sure. So we walk up the road, and sure enough, in the middle of this old field is this big old Victorian farmhouse. And you know, they have this whole story. Well, it used to be like a Bible camp, and they used to, you know, but there's just graffiti in there and things like that. So they asked me to. Obviously, I'm the chump who gets to go in the window first. So I go through the window, and if you've ever been in an abandoned house before, there's not really anything too surprising. It's debris everywhere and things like that, wallpaper peeling and whatnot. But I peeked around the corner into the other room, and I thought I saw what looked like rocks and bricks had been all laid out on the floor. So I asked my friends, I'm like, they hadn't come in yet. I'm like, when's the last time you guys were up here? And they're like, they're like, I don't know, a year or two. They said, were there like rocks laid out in a design here? Now, one of my friends, I totally wouldn't put it past him to lie, like this would be a prank. My other friend, though, is kind of like a straight shooter. He's the type of guy that if he lied, it would like break him in half. And he goes, no, there was nothing in there. So they come in, we all go in the room, and I kid you not, this living room, someone has taken bricks and chunks of rock and has assembled a pentagram in the middle of the room. And it was pretty freaky. I mean, I was like, wow, you know, and we did what any responsible country kid should do. We just trashed the whole place and threw the bricks out the window because we thought they'd be funny. You know, now a week later, we're laying on the dock. Someone's like, we should go up to the Devil House. I'm like, sure, why not? Again, it's very obvious at this point I had not seen a lot of horror movies. We go back out there, and sure enough, somebody has put those bricks and rocks right back where they belonged. So at this point, now I have to clarify, and I'm not denigrating, and I know you talked about this earlier. So I was raised Baptist. And what you have to understand about Baptist kids is what we consider to be dangerous and risky. It's a little lower than what some other people consider to be dangerous and risky. So we thought it would be appropriate at this point, because obviously Satanists were hanging out here. We thought it would be appropriate to come back another weekend with white and pink spray paint. And we were going to trash the room again and just spray paint all this graffiti all over the wall, like hearts and flowers and all this Jesus loves you and stupid things like that. And that was at the end of the summer. So we did that, you know, we're kind of giving ourselves like Baptist high fives for striking a blow against Satan himself, I guess. So a whole year passes. One summer later, sure enough, we're on the dock. We should go to the Devil House. Okay. So we go back up to the Devil House, and I kid you not, this part's all true. Our first thing that we notice is different is somebody has boarded up the window. Well, that doesn't stop us. Of course, we rip the boards off. So we go into this room. I kid you not. First of all, someone has painted the whole room stark white. Someone has installed a brand new floor. And now in the floor, someone has carved the pentagram. There's runes in the middle of the pentagram. And on the point of every single pentagram is a little stick figure with a red slash through it. Like, well, there's a cat, there's a dog. The only one that doesn't have a red slash through it is a human being. Now, this was moderately freaky. We never went back to the house again after that. But this is what really started, like, because at that point as a writer, writing about aliens, spaceships, you know, big epic space opera confrontations, it wasn't doing it for me anymore. But suddenly the wheels started turning in my head, and I'm like, this is Cooperstown, New York, Baseball Hall of Fame, Corvette Museum. This is like Americana, like perfect town. Somebody in this town has got some awful interesting activities that they are hiding, and who knows who it is. And like I said, maybe it was still an elaborate prank that these people were playing on kids like us. But whatever the reason, this whole thing started really, for the first time in my life, I'm thinking, you know, aliens from another planet, that's not scary. Monsters from another planet, that's not scary. I want to write about the stuff that's right here, that's hiding in the perfect little town, that's hiding in the perfect little family, that's like over there in the corner that you don't quite see. And that was when I just totally switched gears and I started trying to write. It took a long time for me to say I'm a horror writer. For a long time, I was like, oh no, I'm a supernatural thriller writer. But that was when I pivoted and said, you know, these strange, mysterious things that hide in the shadows, that is far more interesting to write about. And I was never able to get my friends to go back to that house. I wanted them to go back. They would never go back. I finally went back on my own, and it had been demolished. Just not even there anymore.
You see, that was going to be my question.
Which is a great story.
You have to go back.
Which is a great story, too, because now here I am walking around this empty field. I'm like, did I dream this whole thing? Where is this house? I know it was here. I did find some rubble in the middle of the field. So I'm like, well, I guess this is where the house was. And then when I was driving around, one of the neighbors asked me if I was looking for something, and I said them. And she says, yeah, they had to tear that house down. Too many kids were breaking in. Like, oh, you don't say.
Really?
Really? Too many kids were breaking in. Oh, I don't know.
Those little bastards.
I know. I don't know anything about that. So, yeah. That was it, though. That's what pivoted me over to writing stories like that.
Well, that's a far better story than mine. But yeah, I would say that the funny thing is, I think for a lot of people, horror is one of those things. The word is scarier than anything. For whatever reason, the connotations, whether it comes from the lowest variety of film or whatever it is, the connotations have made people really gun shy about just embracing the label. But by the same rate, we can add a new label, and people have tried many times. Remember that when in the mid '90s, where dark fantasy was supposed to take over the world, whatever that means. But you just make a new stigma attached to a new word. Then it doesn't matter. Now, marketing is different. We all know that big publishers are probably never going to come back around to putting horror on the spine. But the reality is, horror is about a reaction from the audience. You know, it's not about having a monster. You don't have to have a monster. You can have a horror novel where no one dies. I mean, I'd say horror does revolve around mortality and morality, but that doesn't mean you have to go any specific place with those things. So I think that for some of us, it just was inevitable, right? We had to come back to it because we wanted to draw those feelings out of people.
Doug Wright, he's a critic. He's also a fiction writer. He was one of my instructors at Borderlands Press. I think he gave the best quote was that horror is an emotion. You know, we turn it into a label. This is a horror movie or horror show, but horror is an emotion. So any story where a character experiences some level of an emotional feeling of horror, that's horror. And like you said, it doesn't have to have a monster. It doesn't have to have a mucus slavering demon bent on raping virgins. You know, and in fact, it's actually better. You know, that sense of frisson where a person reads something and they're like, "This is making me a little uncomfortable here." That's horror. You know, so it's. And it's funny when you say that about people being gun shy, because I know I was gun shy because I was raised in the 80s. So all I knew of horror, and it's funny because I didn't think of all the books I read that were ghost stories. I didn't think of scary stories to tell in the dark, which I absolutely devoured. For me, horror was Freddy and Jason. And at that point in my life, I had no interest in Freddy and Jason. So when I was thinking about writing horror, before I had discovered Charles Grant and T.M. Wright and Ramsey Campbell, before I had discovered Ray Bradbury's darker fiction, you know, I wasn't sure if horror was for me because I had those echoes of, horror must be slasher and bloodshed. And it took a while to move me out of that place.
Absolutely. Now, Dan has actually asked a second question, so I got to at least get to his second question first. Okay. The first one's still, you still have to wait on the first. But he asks, coming from a religious background, do you have a book and a film that got under your skin and contributed to your love of horror? For me, it was Hellraiser / Hellbound Heart.
Okay, so yeah, it's funny you should ask that because so, and again, we kind of talked about this at the beginning where we want to be careful about talking about certain, but I can tell you that coming from a religious background, that was a little bit of a hurdle for me to get over. I've got this religious background, but I love horror. Of course, now I'm to the point where I'm just like, well, why don't more religious people like horror? I mean, this is like the best stuff. I can tell you that I still have a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction with anything Exorcist related. You know, like, first of all, The Exorcist. I remember one day I had never seen the movie, especially, again, because growing up. Because in our Baptist circles, The Exorcist was whispered like, he watched The Exorcist. So I had never watched it for the longest time. But I remember as an adult, I'm reading The Exorcist, and my wife and my kids are somewhere else. They're away. It's dark. And I'm reading this going, this is really pushing some buttons here. You know, ironically, whose work really tricked some buttons for me as a general faith believer, Gary Braunbeck's work is phenomenal. Because like he wrote a book called Coffin County, and the idea behind the book was that God was so furious that the world killed Jesus that God said, screw it, I'm going to destroy the world. You killed my son. I'm done with you. And the idea is that Judas was so guilt-stricken He just cried out from the depths of hell and said, how can I change this? So God makes a deal with Judas that for every human life he takes, he will extend Earth's stay of execution another day. And Gary Braunbeck then rolls this all into an explanation. Why do we have serial killers? And it was such an astute handling of theological things without being pedantic. And then as someone who believes in the ever after and things like that, you're reading this going, wow, this is challenging and kind of frightening, but really interesting at the same time. And like I said, I love any work that traffics in that good versus evil. I will say this too. As a Christian, I wasn't sure if I should like horror. And then I know you and I talked about Stephen King before, but I was reading Desperation, and I was on the fence about should a Christian or someone who has a religious background, should they like Stephen King? And I'm reading Desperation by Stephen King. And yeah, it's got all the R-rated elements there. But I'm like, this is an exegesis on faith, on the conflict of faith, on why do bad things happen? Is God punishment or God love? And that really propelled me toward, look, horror is a way to grapple with all like Gary Braunbeck wrote a book called To Each Their Darkness. It's a nonfiction book. I highly recommend you look it up, about why he wrote horror. And at some point in the book, he says, I write horror because I want to know why. Why do people kill themselves? Why do awful things happen? Why do all these terrible things happen? Why does it seem like God doesn't care? And I write to figure out why. And for me, from a religious background, that was huge because I'm like, I want to know why too. And that's why I write these stories. I know there's probably not going to be an answer, but I almost don't need an answer. I just need to vocalize my why. Why do these things happen? Sorry, that was a really long-winded answer, which my students are very used to, by the way. So,
see, it's interesting because I never had religious beliefs, but yet I'm a huge Blatty fan, and I'm actually except for a few titles which were misses for me, I really love Braunbeck as well. Daniel actually mentioned Indifference of Heaven in the chat, and yeah, that's a masterpiece. Of course,
that crushed me. Absolutely crushed me. That novel.
I could not believe that Leisure put it out under the In Silent Graves title for pretty much the mass market. I mean, it was in every Borders, every Barnes and Noble, which some people say that's not still mass market. I don't know. I don't think there is a more mass market than that anymore. But
yeah, exactly.
So I think the thing is, people from a religious background come at these same questions as someone from a non-religious background comes at.
Yes.
Just the diction is different.
Yeah. Yep.
It comes down to vocabulary but the concepts are really similar. I don't think that trying to figure out why bad things happen is unique to a worldview at all.
Oh, no, I don't think so. I think that was a personal angle for me. Like I was trying to, because like I said, if I'm at church and someone's like, oh, you write horror, and you can kind of see them like sliding away from you. So no, I agree with you. In fact, I used to write a quarterly article for Lamplight magazine called Horror 101. And one of the articles I was going to write was going to be on faith and horror. And I'm a very good friend, an amazing author. You should all go read Bracken McLeod, read Stranded, read Come to Dust. He's a wonderful writer. And I love Bracken. He's like one of those guys because he's big bear hugs. He's a wonderful, loving human being. But when I was posting this on Facebook, he said, I do hope you keep in mind that those of us who are atheists, we believe in faith too. But our faith is developed from something different.
I'm not going to agree with that at all. I think the word faith smuggles in some things. But again, we're talking about
I guess
differences.
Talking semantics, but I think what he wanted to get across was that atheists are not people just that have no beliefs,
No.
And he was hoping that with my article I would be sensitive to that, which I definitely tried to be.
Well, we can right now. You and I could spend the rest of the show just going over all kinds of things that we believe.
We
right?
should, yeah, we could,
and
yeah.
Then, and then there would be like this one thing at the end, which you would say you would use the word faith to describe, and I would say I don't have that. But
Right.
we'd have 1,000 things before that we agreed on that
Yep.
are based on belief. That is belief based on information that's secondhand. I haven't done every scientific experiment to prove that gravity exists as we know it, but I have dropped a pen. So
Right,
we
exactly.
both sit there and say, we both believe
Yep.
that gravity, as the concept we're taught, is a real thing.
Yep.
But it is belief, right?
Yes.
Faith is a little bit of a different question because you can't drop a god and see if he falls.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So that's the question at the core of it. But I think it's interesting because I think there's I always liken it to the uncanny valley. You know, when you look at a mannequin and you see a human shape, but you know it's not human, we all have
Right.
that same reaction, right? It's creepy.
Yeah.
Right. It's unsettling. Just like a doll that looks too close to being a real baby is unsettling.
Yep.
It doesn't matter how much you know about how that mannequin or that doll was created, or that what it's made of, or that it's sold in stores. You still have the reaction because there's something hardwired in us. Now,
Right.
how you choose to describe that feeling, that's what we're talking about when we talk about whether it comes from a religious place or not. But
Right. Yeah.
I think that the basic human questions are all relevant no matter what
Yeah.
our backgrounds are. And I think that's why horror works. I think that's if we didn't share as much in common, horror would not work.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. I agree.
And I need to segue here for a second because someone would like to say hello to you.
Hello, Chad. How are you? Good to see you.
And
A Foster Home and Flies. Everyone go buy that right now. A Foster Home and Flies by Chad. Go buy that right now. Buy all of his books.
And Tim from Lost Cunningham. Oh, that's the wrong comment. There we go. Is happy that Chad is with us.
Yeah. Yeah. Go buy all of his books right now.
So now I'm going to get to Dan's first question because we're going to come back to your work. And he wanted to know about, can't find it to highlight it, but he wanted to know about your Clifton Heights series, which you made reference to without actually naming the town a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
So is that a framework that you developed very consciously? Like you wanted to have a common setting the way that Stephen King has mapped out most of Maine? Or was it more of just you kind of write what you're familiar with and the things that disturb you about the locale that you're familiar with?
So here's how it started. It actually came from a failed novel. Way back in the yesteryear of, let's say, 2006, 2007, I had kind of made the jump from sci-fi to horror. Now, I love the Adirondacks. Now, we grew up going to the Adirondacks every year for vacation as a kid. The early years of our marriage, my wife had a friend in the family who had a cabin up there. And there's just something, for me, there's something atmospheric about the Adirondacks. I knew I always wanted to set something up there. I tried to write several novels, and at that point, I hadn't figured out how to take a story from A, B, C, conflict resolution, finish. So what I had was a lot of one-off vignettes because I was also a fan of, The Stand, which got like 14 main characters. I was trying to rewrite The Stand in Salem's Lot in the Adirondacks. So what I found myself with was all these little handful of vignettes about all these characters. And the wheels started turning in my mind. I'm like, you're trying to develop this big story about this vampire incursion. But, this loser drunk over here who's like stricken with guilt, that's almost more interesting. And this little story over here, you got about this combat veteran who's got PTSD, and they're all in this little town. That's almost a little more interesting. So kind of semi-consciously, I just started trying to focus on little stories. And I'm like, my thought was when I, someday write the big blockbuster novel that'll, give me fame and fortune, I'll already have a short story collection, So I started writing these stories. And then along the way, I discovered Gary Braunbeck's Cedar Hill cycle. I discovered Charles Grant's Ox Run Station. You know, I stumbled into Bradbury's Greentown. And I'm like, I really want to do this. I want to make my own town. But I was also thinking, I don't want book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, where if you haven't read book 1 and 2, then you can't write book 3. I just want to write standalone stories that can be read in any order. There's a couple where it's very clear this book occurs 2 years after this other book, but I don't want dangling plot lines. I want to just develop this town. And for me, the idea just really seemed very powerful. Like, what are all the stories of these average people, these regular people, these marginalized people, or the people who are on the outskirts, the type of people you would never notice, you know, that janitor over there or that hard on his luck guy over there. You know, I remember one day having to pay my electric bill and standing in line and looking at all the people that from the different walks of life and how they're just all regular people. And all we wanted to do was pay our electric and go home. And I thought to myself, like, what if we were all stuck here? What if some, you know, and that became the novella, you know, and I watered it with tears about these people who are trapped. And that's where Clifton Heights got its, you know, it's kind of its birth. And to me, the possibilities are endless. You know, when you think of just regular people who live in this town. Now, it does pose some logistical, like, how much crazy stuff can possibly happen in one town and people not notice, right? So there's a threshold.
People still live there.
Right. So but that also has had to make me choose my characters very carefully. And also, too, I'm almost finished with one of my first novels in Clifton Heights. And I've decided, you know what? This novel is just going to address it flat out. This place is screwed up. You know, and then like how else do you address that? I'm just gonna be like, you know what? Why even try to be clever? We're just gonna have like the police chief be like, I don't know why anyone still lives here. You know what I mean? So I don't know if I'll ever get finished with that. But that's and like I said, but that's also had me choose the characters very carefully, because if really noticeable people were always disappearing. So I had to think of like, well, who are the people that you see on the street every single day? And if you walk by them, if that person disappeared the next day, would you even know? You know, I will say that there have been some visitors to this town that unfortunately meet, you know, but again, visitors are transient people, you know. I mean, they check into a hotel, they check out the next day, who knows what happened to them. So that has posed an issue where I've had to be very careful about the characters I write about, because if you really want to think about it very hard, like you said, who the heck would stay in this town? You know, but I don't think you can overestimate the whole concept of this is a small town. It's insular. Nobody talks about what's really happening. Nobody talks about this thing that happened. That because why? Because we don't talk about those sort of things. At some point, there's going to be a moment where I'm going to have to think to myself, I really probably need to write something that happens in a different town, you know. And I've got several books that are in the works that are different locales, you know, just so I can try to stretch my legs elsewhere. But that's a very long-winded explanation of Clifton Heights. So
it's funny because small towns have personal histories, the same way people do.
Yep.
But there are also histories that are manipulated. So, and that's something I personally find very fascinating. I had an early short story where there was a character, and this was important because of what was happening psychologically / supernaturally in the story to him. But he had taken to changing the names on old tombstones, like turn of the century tombstones, because no one would know the difference. And he was out there chiseling like different letters and different spellings and making people junior, because no one would be able to fact check it, or no one would fact check it at the very least. And It was kind of like as his personal history was changing. But I think that happens to towns.
Yep.
because I think every generation brings their version of that personal history. So the interesting thing is, this is a really common conversation people have, like, why would anyone still live in Crystal Lake, right?
Right.
Hey, let's go down to the lake and go fishing. No, it's probably a bad idea because the last 150 people didn't do so well.
They all died. Yeah.
But on the same rate, realistically, how many times did you go back to that house in the woods, in the field as a kid? The Devil's
It was
Shoes?
3 or 4 times, yeah.
So is it really that crazy? The same way that people always scream about, oh, that girl woke up in the middle of the night because she heard a sound, so she put on she's in her negligee, she walked down into the basement. That's crazy. But I can tell you that I've woken up in the middle of the night, heard a sound, and went to go investigate. I've done it.
Daryl Schweitzer, I don't know if you're familiar with Daryl Schweitzer. Yeah. He's written mostly short stories. He wrote a nonfiction book about Lovecraft that I remember reading a couple of years ago, where he said that people like to slam Lovecraftian protagonists because you're like, okay, come on, who's really going to read that forbidden tome of knowledge? And Schweitzer's like,
I would.
Everyone would. That's what humans do. Humans have this cursed I want to know, even if I don't think I should be. That's the basis for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Frankenstein and Invisible Man. I want to know. And I thought that was very insightful that Schweitzer said that. Look, and he's like, in some Lovecraftian fiction, it does become very pastiche-y, but it's not that unrealistic. Human beings are, look at the atom bomb, look at everything else. Human beings are always probing in the areas they really should not.
Also, we tend to be, I don't know why this happened. I think it because he became the big name in the genre in very quickly. Like, he'd been a cult figure in the 60s and 70s, and then in the late 70s, he started really picking up steam, and then movie adaptations happened. Not that there wasn't in the 60s, because there was a couple, but he became such a big name so quickly that he got put under a microscope for everything. And some of it is, some of it's not defensible, and some of it is completely defensible.
Right.
But the interesting thing is, we're basically picking at like 38 stories. That's the body of work.
Yep.
And wow, you know what I'm saying? Almost 100 years later, to be looking back at less than 40 pieces of fiction,
yes,
and pretending like this is a body of work like Oscar Wilde, it's kind of insane.
Yep. Yeah, and it's funny too when you talk about Lovecraft. Like I said, there's certain things about Lovecraft you can't, like, that's one of those things that along the lines where you said don't talk about politics or religion, let's not talk about Lovecraft and racism either. That's always huge. My feeling is you obviously have to have that conversation about the racism, but you can't deny and maybe he wasn't the best writer, but you can't deny the impact his ideas about cosmic horror and the other, for ill or for good, has had on horror. It is a huge impact.
Well,
and just culture in general, video games.
There's an uglier side to it than all that, I think. Yeah. No one wants to hear this, but that xenophobia that is so easy for us to decry, and rightfully that we should decry it to some degree, may be part of why the fiction works. He's holding a mirror up to society saying, this is where we're at. Now, obviously, how we view it today is a lot different than how a reader in 1933 would have viewed it. But it doesn't matter. It endures because the mirror was held up.
Right.
So, in a way, I wonder if he didn't have such pernicious views, if he'd be remembered at all. Because the fiction probably wouldn't have had those themes. How can you write about cosmic horror if you're not afraid of the big bad world?
Yeah. Yep.
I don't know.
Yeah.
So, Tim actually has a good point adding to our discussion of small towns and histories, which is, I guess, live streams and chats are the new virtual small towns.
I haven't seen that movie Host yet. Have you seen that? It's on Shudder, talking about horror. And, I got to be honest, I started watching it and I was like, maybe it's because I spent my entire spring in Zoom meetings with my students. And I'm like, I can't do this right now. I'm done with Zoom. But I didn't feel enough to pull me through the rest of them. I just kind of stopped after 5 minutes, 10 minutes.
So, personal confession here. and this is not a statement about how anyone else should view anything. I hate technology in horror. Hate it. Cell phones I use in my fiction because it's just simply not realistic to ignore it.
Right.
Almost anything else I just will never use as a plot point because it changes too quickly. In 3 years, it's not going to be relevant anyway.
Right.
And I kind of hate where we're at with technology and the fact that we're all kind of addicted to these things on some level. So to me, it cheapens the fiction and we're removing the human element, which is what I'm interested in.
Right.
We fetishize cell phones and technology enough now that I don't want to watch a movie about Zoom.
Yeah, I lost interest very quickly in that movie. I was like, no.
Now, I'll tell you what I think is true, though. Old technology works.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason I think Ringu works is by the time that movie came out, VHS tapes were already kind of an archaic thing.
Exactly, yeah. Yes.
But it works because of that, because we feared the obsolete.
Yep.
And that's a Dracula thing, you know. Dracula was the fear of the old Europe invading the new Europe.
Yeah, exactly.
And so when we have a curse that's on a videotape in the age of DVD, well, that's scary because there's some suggestions there.
Yeah.
So there's a little side conversation that I want to point out. Griffin in the chat is saying that he just recently read Brian Hodges' Nightlife and he's almost finished with The Darkest Saints.
Right.
And I've touched base with him. Oh, Brian is, I think, the most important figure of modern horror. Period.
Yep.
And I wanted to point out to everyone that Griff is having a great time with these books, and he hasn't even gotten to the masterpiece. Prototype, the third book in that trilogy, is going to destroy him, and it'll destroy all of you. Go find a used copy, guys, because unfortunately it's not currently in print. But go out there and get it. It's amazing. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the essays, the Horror 101 essays.
Sure.
So I find it interesting that there's a cottage industry that exists simultaneously or parallel to horror fiction, which is horror writers talking about what they do and the history of what came before them. And it goes a long way back. I mean, Lovecraft wrote supernatural fiction in literature. Stephen King wrote Dance Macabre. And modernly, I mean, wow. I mean, Cemetery Dance at this point is as much a historical registry of the genre as it is a fiction entity anymore.
Yep.
Same thing with Fangoria on the film side of it. They're not about breaking news anymore or set visits. They're about talking about what the genre means. So tell me a little bit about your journey into that side of the field.
So this is this all came from an amazing experience. Okay. So long story short, when I first started thinking, okay, I want to write horror, I pretty much read what I would call my holy trinity of horror. I read Stephen King, I read Peter Straub, which you can't go wrong with Peter Straub, and I read Dean Koontz, with the occasional sidebar into John Saul, and I never quite landed with John Saul. But that's all I read. Then I had the amazing opportunity because I attended Borderlands Press Writers Boot Camp, and I learned under Gary Brombeck and Mort Castle, F. Paul Wilson, Tom Montiello, and Gary Brombeck, and Doug Wright also. And I was running a creative writing program in my school, so I invited Paul Wilson and Tom up to my school to teach my students. Well, one night while they were here, they invited me to come hang out with them. And unbeknownst to me, Stuart David Schiff of Whispers Magazine lives in Binghamton. So here I am at Stuart David Schiff's house with Paul Wilson and Tom Montiello, and they are just talking about everything about the history of horror. I'm sitting there going, I don't know any of these names. Like, I don't know any of this stuff. So that propelled me into this, like really just started. And that's when I discovered Charles Grant and T.M. Wright and Manly Wade Wellman and just all these writers. But at the same time, I also read a book called The Philosophy of Horror by Noel Carroll. It's a nonfiction book that it's kind of like a little bit more of an academic version of Danse Macabre. And it was excellent. It was just really, really excellent. And all I was doing at first was just posting about it on my blog. I'm like, oh, this is really cool. Reflections on this. And I was thinking maybe I should do some reading into it. Well, and may rest in peace, Lawrence Santoro of Tales to Terrify him. He approached me and said, I love what you're doing on your blog. Could you do this as a podcast segment for Tales to Terrify? And at first I was like, wow, I don't know if I can do that. But I said, sure. So then I started with like the Castle of Otranto, the monk, the mysteries of Udolpho. I started reading from there and then progressing and doing this monthly podcast segment called Horror 101 on Tales to Terrify. Now, I ended up running into technical issues at home. My laptop crashed. I couldn't get a good laptop, so I couldn't continue it. But then Jacob Haddon from Lamplight Magazine, again, when Jesus Gonzalez passed away, he said, look, Jesus was writing, and I've only got to meet him a couple times, but man, I remember hanging out with him at a birthday party for Bob Ford, and he and I were just talking about all of this. But Jacob Haddon goes, I really want someone to write something scholarly, and he knew of my podcast. He's like, can you continue that with me for Lamplight Magazine? So that's when I continued it from Lamplight Magazine, and I studied ghost stories and haunted house stories and monster stories and the weird, and I just found it, for me personally, I mean, yes, I was writing articles, I was getting paid to write articles. But for me, it was such a illuminating experience just to read all this stuff and write about it. I think that's what was like. It was like I was going to grad school for horror, So yeah, it was cool to write and get published, but it was a very personal exploration for me to really, again, continue to kind of mull over what do I want to be as a horror writer. And that's how I got into that. And then when I landed the column at Revelations saying, well, I want to write about these figures who really have shaped who I am. And I think it was, for me, just that one night. It all goes back to that one night with Paul Wilson, and Stuart Davis. I'm like, I have no idea who these people are talking about, and I am ashamed. When Tom's like, oh man, have you ever read Carl Edward Wagner? I'm like, no. So it was just like, I'm like, I have to teach myself this stuff. And, as a writer, I teach myself by writing. So that's how it was for me anyway.
Yeah, I'll tell you what. I had a not exactly apples to apples, but an experience whereas I realized how little I know. And the first thing I did is I dug through used bookstores and found as many of the year's best anthologies, edited by Carl Edward Wagner, to get a grasp on what had come before, because I knew I couldn't jump. It was too early at that point. I was maybe like 13, 14, 15, right, somewhere in there. I couldn't rush to Robert Chambers and Eldron Blackwood. I couldn't do that yet.
Right.
Just being realistic. And I knew that novels were also going to take up a huge amount of time for me to have any sense of history behind me. But those anthologies, those year's best, which listen, I love what Ellen Datlow later did, but those Wagner paperbacks,
so
my God.
So I have a whole section dedicated to that over there. And I spent a whole 2 years of my life. And I would suggest to anyone out there, it's criminal actually how cheap they are, because I found them for like a penny on Amazon. The year's best Carl Edward Wagner collections. And what blows my mind is I have this mental image of Carl Edward Wagner sitting in this office, surrounded by every periodical and magazine known to man, looking like you would read through those collections and be like, this is an amazing story. This author must have made it big. Then you go do a Google search. This is the only story this author wrote. I've never heard of. He found a horror story that was in Runner magazine.
Yeah.
Or he found a horror story that was in a limited chapbook at World Fantasy in Britain. And It was just amazing to me. I really, I can't stress enough to folks that are watching this. If you're young and you haven't started writing yet, go find those Carl Edward Wagner anthologies, because they just blew me away and how awesome they were. Yeah.
And then broken record time, because everyone on this show is way tired of me talking about it. Charlie Grant's Shadows anthologies, and then Tom Monteleone's Borderlands anthologies, and finally finish it up with the Horror Library anthologies, including this book.
You and I are both in that book.
You and I are both in that book.
First big sale too. It was like, holy crap, Horror Library! I made it. I'm in a book with Lauren Dixon. Finally.
Somehow I doubt that was the name on the back here that you were impressed with. I think maybe Bentley Little.
Yes, Ray Garton.
Ray Garton, Jeff Strand. Yeah, this is it. But we're also and I just want to point out that Dev Jarrett is also in here. So one of our shared friends also.
Before we run out of time, 2 other anthologies I would recommend. The Whispers anthologies were amazing too, because what I really liked about those is they were speculative anthologies. They weren't necessarily horror. So you'd have a horror story, you'd have a Twilight Zone story, you'd have a high fantasy story. And the Masks anthologies by J.N. Williamson, they were pretty good too. I liked those as well. So
yeah, I mean, he had a habit of including a few novellas in there. And that I think that's what slowed me down.
Mm-hmm. Oh, J.N. Williamson's he's an interesting writer to discuss too.
Oh,
Too bad we don't have another hour to talk about those books, but anyway.
So there was a couple questions here because we are running out of time, so I want to make sure we get people. First off, good friend and peer Christian Hanahora wants to just tell you he loves your Stranger Things shirt. He knows that I've never seen any Stranger Things, so.
You know what? If you don't like Stranger Things or you don't want to watch Stranger Things, you should watch 1984 on Shudder. That was like, Stranger Things is lovely, but it's sometimes a little too saccharine sweet, like, oh, 80s are awesome. 1984 on Shudder is a period 80s movie without some of that Stranger Things gloss. So, Lauren, I would highly recommend that to you. Anyway, next question.
So Griffin is going a little bit off table, but I love it.
Sure.
Asking, what are your top 3 favorite horror films?
Oh, that's tough. Ooh, so with this YouTube channel, I have like blitzed my brain with horror films the last couple of years. So The Ritual was amazing. I love The Ritual. That was just a very, very, very good film. I guess I'm remembering things right. VFW was a lot of fun. That was on Shudder here recently, and that was a lot of fun. It's hard because I've watched so many movies. I really liked the Autopsy of Jane Doe. I thought that was really, really a really well done film. There's a lot more probably in there, but those are the ones I could pull off the top of my head.
That's cool. I'm going to throw at you that you need to see Saint Maud.
I've heard that. Yeah.
Unreal.
Okay.
Unreal how good it is. I love A24 and I love literate horror films. So I love Hereditary and The Witch and Midsummer and Lighthouse just under them, just a step down. But Saint Maud swims up there right with Hereditary and The Witch. Okay. Today I actually saw an Indian zombie comedy called Zombie Ready, and it was one of the most batshit insane things I've ever seen in my life. It was like if this is why I said this to my friends on the Region Free show. I texted out to them that it was like a Reddit community decided to make a Indian zombie film. So it's ADD addled and it goes everywhere at full speed. It's like someone running into a wall repeatedly as fast as they can.
Oh, that's great.
Amazing. Not all the jokes land. In fact, I'd say for me, none of the jokes landed, but I was transfixed by how far they were willing to go with absolutely everything. So, Daniel, that's Ready, REDDY, and Google the word. You'll understand why that is. So We just hit the hour point, so we're going to just roll down this show in just a moment. The curtains are going to close, but I wanted to make sure everyone knew how they could stay in touch with you and give you the opportunity to give any final words out to people.
Well, I'm on Facebook, Kevin B. Lucia. I'm also on Twitter, Kevin Lucia, so you can follow me there. I have an infrequent blog at kevinlucia.blogspot.com. I do have a monthly newsletter where if you're not averse to receiving a newsletter from me every month, I'll give you 3 free ebooks as part of the deal. All you have to do is go to kevinlucia.blogspot.com. And the field is right up there in the top. And you sign up, and I send you 3 free ebooks, and you get to listen to my ramblings once a month. So, yeah, that's about
He's
it.
He's a way better deal than I am. I don't give you anything except for this show. That's it. So, Kevin.
Yes.
We both got our start like really around 2007, 2008.
Yes.
We fought up with those short story sales. We got some bylines and some books. Where does it all go from here? I mean, what do you want to see happen for yourself, for me, for all those people who are struggling alongside us that may perhaps names aren't as readily available? What does the future of the genre look like to you?
I think what you're really going to see is what I see right now is I see the small press really kind of swelling to include not only brand new names, but for example, Ronald Kelly, who was of Zebra fame, he's suddenly popping off 3-4 short story collections in a row with Crossroads Press. So what I see is the small press has really stepped up in the last 4 or 5 years and become not only the sanctuary for maybe old vanguard writers who are probably not going to sell a New York book again, but folks like you and I probably did the same thing where we sent stories off to magazines where all we were doing is getting a contributor copy. And then when we got it, it looked like it had been printed off and stapled at Kinko's. That's where we started. Yeah, we started, right? And we've just kind of kept writing so I think you have a kind of a brand, but then also too, you have people like, if he's still there, Chad Ludzik, who started self-publishing his works. And now he's one of the most in-demand short story writer names. So I think you have this kind of brave new world where you have hybrid publishing, you have people who are working exclusively with a small press. I've been fortunate to spend the last 4 or 5 months just writing novellas for Cemetery Dance. I think that you've got this groundswell of small press work that has become a place for horror writers to write what they love, which is not to say that there's anything wrong with landing the New York City contract, with getting a Netflix film made of your book. No one here is going, but I think it's important. Not too long ago, I saw somebody kind of slamming Josh Mallerman just because he had a Netflix deal for his books and everything like that. And then I said, look, I've hung out with Josh Mallerman. Josh Mallerman is one of us. He loves the genre. Josh and I were just geeking out over the horror genre. And I think that, like you said, if we can keep our focus on not eating ourselves, because you know how that happens, drama pops up and everyone picks a side and we have to eat ourselves over these things. We are the chosen few who love the weird stuff. And like you said, we're here to help each other, not to drag other people down or try to get ahead. And I see a future in the horror genre. Like, for example, an upstart publisher, Cemetery Gates and Cemetery Gates Media. They went from being guys who were crowdfunding and self-publishing their own work to now Gabino Iglesias edits an anthology for them. And they know their stuff. They love horror. So I think you have, with these tools we have the opportunity for people who love horror to produce quality horror for people who just want to read quality horror, whether it be a New York Times bestseller or a new person. That's what I see for the horror genre.
It is the same click of a finger on a mouse to buy a small press book by someone with a really intriguing concept as a major publisher now. That's never existed before. In the last 10 years, I'm not sure how you define small press, mass market press. I'm not sure how you do it anymore because the reach, hypothetically, isn't so different.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and even with Clifton Heights, even with Crystal Lake, my books have distribution, in bookstores, and that's something that you couldn't have gotten even 5 or 6 years ago. And like you said, not to slam big book publishers, but if someone's going to click $15 for an ebook or $3.99 for an ebook,
Yeah. Well, and listen, I'd love to play with the big boys. There's no question about it.
Who would say no? Exactly.
But the question is, does it change the work?
Yes.
I am who I am. You are who you are. I don't see that changing. We have to invite the right publisher to the dance and then go home at night with them.
Yep.
That's the challenge. We can't just go for the big shiny name.
Right.
It has to be the right person.
If I could be allowed to name drop one last author for all of our
absolutely,
because folks, I am just as much of a reader as I am a writer, and I was a reader before I ever was a writer. So I remember many years ago, I was at Horror Find, and I was talking with Ron Malfi, and we were talking about how I had a near brush with New York publishing, and I actually got to talk with an acquisitions agent, and they passed on it predictably, but Ron was like, "I'll never work with New York." Because Ron is a wonderful writer, and he's made a wonderful career with himself with Kensington. Mm-hmm. Before that, with Medallion, he's got a new book coming out with Titan. But Ron is going to write what he feels is true, and that is more important than, again, I don't think any of us would say no to a big contract. No. But at the end of the day, that's more important than the big contract, is knowing that I have written something that is true to who I am. I mean, if you do that, some people read it, you get some spare change along the way, and you have fun doing it. I don't know of any better occupation, quite honestly.
And I can't think of a better place to leave it than those words. We will be back on Monday with a Just Talking genre show. That's the show where you guys ask me questions and I pretend I know what I'm talking about. And then on next Friday, I'll be joined by Rath James White at 8 p.m. for a conversation about... Yes, exactly. Go ahead.
Okay. One last story for you.
Okay.
My very first convention was MoCon, hosted by Maurice Broaddus. I was supposed to stay with somebody in his church. I get to the airport. Maurice calls me and says, "So we've had to change some things. You're rooming with Rath White James." I'm like, "What?" And I always like a joke and say that when I opened the door, Rath was doing one-arm push-ups while reading Socrates. So, which is not necessarily true, but it really is very believable. So yeah, Rath is one.
I buy that.
That'll be an awesome show.
Yep. And then in a week after that, Mike Arnzen joins us on the 19th. And then on the 22nd for a morning show, a very rare morning show, we're going to jump across the pond and talk to Ramsey Campbell for an hour. So join us for the rest of the month, guys. And if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe to the channel. It makes all the difference in the algorithm actually recommending these videos, because YouTube supports the big and kind of ignores the small. So make sure you make us bigger. Thanks much. Have a great one. Stay safe.
Thank you.